Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to be doing some exam review, and specifically we're going to be talking about the concept of regions. Now before we begin, I think it's important that we understand when we talk about regions, what we're really discussing is what we call the regionalization process. So really all this is, when we talk about regions, is different ways to understand space and different ways that we can study space. So when we look at regions, we're going to find that there are three different types of regions, or we classify regions in three different kinds of ways. And the way that we classify them is based upon the types of characteristics that we're looking at within the space. So you see the list there. We have the formal, also called the uniform, the functional, also called the nodal, and then the perceptual, also called the vernacular regions. Now you'll notice there that I have listed two different names for each kind of region. Now the reason that I've done that is because, number one, you're never going to really know which terminology is going to be used on the AP exam. Some textbooks will use one term, some textbooks will use another. The other reason I have both of them there is because I think at least if you don't understand one of the terms, is how it relates to the region, I think the other term can be helpful. For instance, if we go here to the formal or the uniform region, I actually think that understanding the idea of uniform is much more helpful when understanding or trying to define that particular type of region. So I have both of those up there just to help you, so that maybe one of those types of terms sticks a little bit more easily in your mind. It helps you understand just a little bit better. So the first time we're going to talk about is what's called the formal region, or also called the uniform region. Now when we talk about the uniform or the formal region, what we're looking at here is a region that has characteristics that are going to be the same or uniform across the space. And that's why I think the term uniform is actually maybe a little bit more helpful in understanding the space. So the characteristic is the same or uniform across the entire space. Now typically the uniform region is going to be tied together by either physical or cultural characteristics of the landscape. So whether we're talking about the physical landscape itself, or we're talking about the cultural landscape itself. Now, what we're going to find is that depending on which attribute of the space we're studying, we're going to see that both the cultural and also the physical landscapes can overlap together. So it's not necessarily separated within the region, but it really just depends on the characteristics that we're looking at. And so when we look at the formal or the uniform region, a couple of examples that we can consider. The first one we have here is the Appalachian Mountains. So again, any type of physical region that you can think of. So the Appalachian Mountain chain is just simply one example of a physical form of region. So you could use the Appalachian Mountain Range, you could talk about the Rocky Mountain Range, you could talk about the Great Plains of the United States, the Great Lakes regions, you talk about the Sahara Desert, you talk about the Gobi Desert. It doesn't really matter. Any of these types of physical features that is going to be incorporated into a larger regions that have similar physical characteristics on the geographic landscape. So that would be an example of a physical geography example. One that's going to be more, and I like this one because it incorporates a couple of different things. It's not just the cultural landscape, but it also talks about the climatic landscape and things along those lines. So the example I have here is the Sun Belt. Now the Sun Belt for us in human geography is important, especially if we look at what's happening in the United States today, some of the modern trends that are happening in the United States today. The Sun Belt, first of all, is, you can see here the region, kind of this red outlining region, the south, that kind of goes from the east coast to the west coast, various parts of different states. The reason that's important really is twofold. Number one, we see this is where a large portion of migrants are moving to in the United States today, whether it's retirees that are moving down south because they want to get away from the cold weather, or if we're looking at even people from the north and the Midwest, northeast and Midwest, are coming down looking for new jobs, because what's happening, aside from the migration pattern that's happening to this area, the Sun Belt, it's also an area where a lot of businesses are moving. Now the Sun Belt is characterized by, you can see the geographic region, but also some of the climatic factors that are part of it. So typically warmer, tends to be some drier climates. In the west you might have more of the arid climates. In the east you might have some of the more temperate climates. Also characterized a lot of times by, I guess it depends on which part of the country you're in, east or west coast, but tends to be more conservative, tends in its politics and its outlook on social Social issues also tends to have more conservative local governments. When we're talking about state governments, lower taxation, well, of course, the exception there would be California. Lower taxation, less likely to have unions, so more right-to-work states. So that's the reason I like the Sun Belt there as an example, is because it's tied together through those characteristics. And you see a variety of characteristics, not just physical geography as far as climatic features, but also some of the cultural geography going on there. But also we look at the changeover and migration that's happening for people moving in different parts of the United States. So talking about whether, really talking more about inter-regional migration throughout the United States. The next type of region we're going to be looking at is what's called the functional or the nodal region. So within the functional or the nodal region, what we find is that the region is going to be held together, or a link is going to be established by some sort of outside force that kind of sits on the landscape. And so within the functional or the nodal region, you have this point or node of influence that is going to influence the entire area. And it's that point or node of influence really that brings the region together. And it's not really a part of the natural landscape, whether it's a part of the physical landscape or a part of the cultural landscape. So it's that one point or node of influence that connects all of the people. And notice there I say it was created by an outside influence. What I mean by that is that humans have put something on the landscape that is going to incorporate all the people into that particular region. And one of the things that we find with the nodal or the functional region is that this one can tend to change over time as the functions or the nodes go away, because we know that a lot of these things that are put on the landscape by humans, don't necessarily last forever, and so these things can tend to change over time. The one thing I want to emphasize about the functional and the nodal region is this singular point or the singular node of influence that is going to hold the region together. You don't have a variety of characteristics that might hold the place together like a cultural form of region. So some examples that we can look at are things like this situation here. You find this in one of your textbooks, an area where you have some TV stations. And so the function or the node that's going to hold this particular region together is going to be the local broadcast station that the people in that particular area are going to be watching. And that's the only characteristic that holds all of those people together. Very similarly, if you look at radio stations or radio towers, you think about the radio tower as a point or node of influence, and within the listening range of that radio tower, that would be the functional region. The other example that I really like, especially as you're getting later in the course, is if you think about market areas. So I was considering the central place theory. So of course, any type of business is going to have a market area, especially if you're thinking like grocery stores. My favorite example really is the pizza delivery zone. You have the pizza delivery place, and then of course all the places that it delivers to are going to be within the functional region. But I like the central place theory because if you think along the terms of what Christaller was talking about, is you have the central place, and then you have the market area that exists around it. So the central place services that market area or the hinterland that exists around it. And so I thought that was pretty good application to something that's a little bit later in the course. So with the functional region here would be the central place, whether we're talking about the city, the town, or the village. The central place itself, and then the market area that exists around it, that would be a part of the functional region. The last one that we're going to talk about is the perceptual or the vernacular region. And again, depending on your vocabulary, either of these are helpful. Obviously, perceptual, talking about individual perceptions. Vernacular is talking about local language, so specific to a smaller group of individuals. So this one, the perceptual, the vernacular region, is, I wouldn't say it's necessarily hard to understand, but it certainly is going to change and fluctuate based upon who you are and where you are. And that's the whole idea behind the perceptual region, because it's the region itself is tied together based upon your perception, your ideas of what that particular region is going to look like. So unlike the formal or unlike the functional or nodal region, this type of region is not going to be exact because we don't have a common list of characteristics that are going to that are going to help us to tie that particular region together. Instead, the region is tied together based upon your understanding. So whatever thing you're going to focus on the most, and there's a variety of different ways we can interpret that or understand it. So it's really going to be based on your opinion. So if you took your classroom and however many students are in your classroom, I have classrooms of 36 or so, and I asked them to define a particular region or what they thought about a particular place, then I'm probably going to come up with 36 different interpretations of that. So you notice it says it can change. Now, it can change really in two ways, actually maybe three, because it can change from person to person. It can also change as I move across space. So as I move to different areas, people are going to have different understandings. And also it can change across time, meaning that as time progresses and people's understanding of a place progresses, then their understanding of that particular region can change as well. Typically the best example, or the most maybe commonly used example, is this idea of the American South. And so we can have all kinds of conversations, and me being from the South, I'm originally from the state of Georgia and lived in the state of Georgia almost all my life. Southerners have kind of this distinct notion of what it means to be Southern, and as you travel across the different parts of the South, you're going to run into varying interpretations. A lot of people who are from kind of the traditional South wouldn't consider a state like Florida really to be a part of the South, because obviously the culture and the history of Florida are much different from the other southern states that were established by English-speaking people as opposed to the Spanish. And you might say the same is true for Louisiana. And certainly you talk to a person from Texas, and they would say, we're not a part of the South. We're Texas. We have our own kind of identity. And so there are a variety of different ways that people go about trying to identify the South. And you see here, this is actually you have a list of different things here, and I know my image kind of gets in the way of some of these. Maybe I'll bring it up over here. And so you have what is it historical? We're talking about the old Confederate states. Is it a place where you have very few high school graduates, so low levels of education? Talking about religion, Baptist, agricultural production, talking about the weather, climatic conditions. Some people like to talk about barbecue. The actual consumption of barbecue and the different types of barbecue. I went to college in South Carolina, and I grew up in Georgia, so vinegar-based barbecue sauce was always a big thing. But in South Carolina, a lot of people like mustard-based, and then of course you go from the pulled pork to the beef forms of barbecue, and so all those are different ways of defining the South. And interestingly enough, one of the things that we ran into a couple of years ago was this idea of redneck, and there was a study done, and of course, being from Georgia, being from kind of northeast Georgia, this idea of redneck was something relatively common, and so when we look at this idea of redneck, even apparently we can't come to a decision on what the idea of redneck is, because an article came out a couple of years ago. And the question was, what are the most redneck cities in the United States? And you would think that, that'd be pretty easy to choose. You'd have a lot of cities from within the South and things like that. And one of the most amazing findings was that they actually had Cleveland, Ohio. Cleveland, Ohio was considered the number 9 redneck city in the United States. And so I guess we can't even come together on what this idea of redneck is, and of course part of that is the statistics that they use, and you come down here. So apparently this is what it means to be redneck based upon this particular real estate site. And some of these might seem relatively common. Riding lawnmowers, tractor repair shops. Apparently that's what it means to be redneck. And watching the sport of NASCAR. Anyway. And so I thought that was just kind of interesting, because when we think of redneck, we think kind of the traditional southern United States. And in this study, you have a city as far north in the Midwest, or not Midwest, sorry, kind of the central United States. Sacramento. I thought people in California were supposed to be a little bit more cultured that. Alright, just to do a brief recap of all the different regions that we've covered so far, or that we covered in this particular session. You have the formal, the functional, and the vernacular. The formal region, or the uniform region, remember, consists of uniform characteristics, typically within the physical or the cultural geography of the space. The functional or the nodal region consists of a point or node of influence and its influence it has over the space, and that one thing is the one thing that unifies that particular space is going to be superimposed on the landscape by humans. And then lastly, the functional or the vernacular or perceptual region is a region that is based on your particular opinions or understandings of a space and is most likely to change not only over time in space but also from person to person. So there you have it. Those are the three different types of regions. The idea of the regionalization process and studying different spaces using the characteristics of that space. Hope you found that to be helpful, and as always, I hope to see you next time.